Salk was a hero. Salk walked on water. Everyone listened to what he had to say. There was a respect for expertise at that time. It's slowly been eroded to the detriment of our society, really of the world.
Welcome to the RANE Insights on COVID-19 podcast. I'm Emily Donahue. Let's listen as RANE founder David Lawrence speaks with Drs. Fred Southwick and Bill Lang for our weekly coronavirus update.
Bill and Fred, thanks again for joining us. It's been a couple weeks. I'd like to bring the audience up to speed, and maybe I'll kick it off with you, Bill.
So where we thought we would be going 2 weeks ago is, I think, where we've gone. The case rates are down substantially, but even with those case rates being down, there's even less confidence in what the case rates that we're seeing because nobody's reporting. The only cases that are getting reported are people who are sick. So it's really throwing off all the data. Many people, they get bad cold symptoms and they don't even take a test, or not even bad cold symptoms. They get mild cold symptoms, don't even bother taking a test. And the ones that do take home tests, that data is not going anywhere. So whatever we're seeing for case rates is, to some extent, public health practitioner adjusted fictitious data. Now, that shouldn't scare people because we've really gotten to a phase in the epidemic, or the series of regionally linked epidemics, that the more useful data is the hospitalization and unfortunately still death data. But even the hospitalization and death data has turned down pretty much across the board in the country. So what we're seeing now is that people are pushing hard to do away with all kinds of restrictions. And just Wednesday, Dr. Walensky from CDC said that CDC will very shortly be coming out with new recommendations on masking, and they're going to change it because of the issues that I brought up with the case rates. You can't use them to make any really careful decisions. You need to be looking at other data, and so that's what they're going to be coming out with. She also said that the new data will be much more tailored to specific situations and not to broad geographic areas, but hasn't really given any more hint as to what that will mean. So I think what we're going to see is recommendation to wear masks in places like hospitals and nursing homes. We don't know what they'll say about schools, but we know that most school systems are removing mask requirements. And I think we're going to see just an extension of the removal of various requirements across the country over the coming 2 to 4 weeks.
Yeah, I agree with Bill. In Florida, our case rate has dropped dramatically, and the hospitalizations have dropped by about 50%. So that's very encouraging. The daily death rate has not changed significantly, but that's expected. It will lag about 3 to 4 weeks after the decrease in cases. So that is encouraging news. There are other parts of the country, for instance, Kentucky is up right now at 400 cases, in some counties up to 400 cases per day per 100,000. So it's not totally quieted down. In some areas it's still active, in other areas it's become quiescent.
Yeah, it is interesting if you're looking at the state-by-state data because Maine, for example, their data indicates that they've had a 350% increase in the number of cases over the past week. Well, I went to the state of Maine Department of Health, and they said, please don't look at that data because what happened was they had a number of their health data experts who are out with COVID, and they're catching up from 2 weeks of data. So they've dumped basically 2 weeks of data, including the peak of COVID, on top of their current data. So that's the only reason why theirs looks so bad. Other than that, pretty much the rest of the country, except Kentucky, is on a fairly significant downward slope.
So some of the headlines, and this recognize that this may be to drive traffic to various media websites, Twitter accounts, etc., have spoken about the new wave of variants, terms like we're going to have to learn to live with COVID, what to be worried about next, etc. Can you share with the audience just, how you guys are thinking about this and what the data is actually showing?
Well, I've been looking at the BA1, which is the original Omicron, versus the BA2, or the stealth Omicron, as they call it, very closely. And what is very frustrating is every day there's a study that says almost the opposite as the previous. The most recent was there was an article in CNN quoting a study that was done, I believe, in Europe. I'm not sure on that, where it said that that BA2 is causing 30% more deaths and significantly more hospitalizations than BA1. But then a National Institute for Communicable Disease study that was just put out yesterday said that looking at South African and European data, that BA1 and BA2 have almost identical hospitalizations, and that when you look at seriously ill amongst those hospitalizations, BA2 is about 10% less on people that, by seriously ill, they typically mean require ICU hospitalization, about 10% less than that for BA1. BA2 is, across the board agrees that it's somewhere around a third more likely to infect others, but it's still susceptible to immunity from vaccination and previous illness to the similar degree. Now, that's not necessarily a high degree, but to a similar degree as BA1, and currently represents about 5 to 6% of cases in the United States. BA2 does, that is.
Yeah, I agree with Bill's assessment. As far as I know, there is no rigorous evidence proving that BA2 is more virulent. In other words, causes more severe disease. That's remotely possible, and I do agree that it's a little bit more contagious than the BA1, and that's why it is taking hold slowly. And as far as cross immunity, it seems reasonably approximately the same, and therefore, if you are infected with BA1, you should not become infected with BA2. And therefore, it's very unlikely, in my estimation, that BA2 is going to take hold as the dominant organism, dominant variant in the near future, or ever for that matter.
Which brings up the question of other variants. And again, you read a lot of people writing stories, looking for eyeballs, are writing about how we're going to have, it's just inevitable, we're going to have another major variant. Well, again, as you all know, I'm not a virologist, but what I have read from some very competent virologists is a theory that because BA1 and now BA2 are both so infectious, that it would be very difficult for any COVID or SARS-CoV-2 virus to modify and become more infectious and at the same time more virulent. Therefore, BA1, BA2 would crowd out anything that is more virulent and maintain BA1, BA2 as the predominant virus that's in circulation. So these theories say that we're probably at the kind of the peak virus with BA1, BA2.
Bill, I agree with that assessment. I thought that Delta was going to be the most contagious, but clearly Omicron beat out Delta dramatically. But it's hard to believe there haven't been any other viruses more infectious than the Omicron. And I think its ability to spread by aerosol has been maximized. In other words, it's highly unlikely that there could be a virus that would be more contagious in the future. And therefore, I agree. I believe we've reached the pinnacle, and this is the last large surge that we will encounter. I may be a little bit out on a limb, but I think most people agree this is the last serious surge. And from here on in, there will be little local increases in cases, and we will just have to have really a thermometer diagram showing the degree of activity in your area, and depending on the form of the level of activity, you can adjust how you behave. In other words, if the activity in your area is high, then you wouldn't go to the movie theater, you wouldn't go to crowded environments, When it's low, you'd feel comfortable. If it's very high, maybe for temporarily the schools will have to use masks, and then when it lowers, they can back off the mask. But I think it's going to be a very dynamic and changing approach, and no rigidity. Oh, you're changing your mind. No, we're adjusting to the conditions as they arrive, and that's the important thing. And one of the things that I've realized is, as an infectious disease specialist, I have had to learn flexibility in my recommendations, because all organisms, bacteria and viruses, mutate and want to escape whatever the anti-infective or vaccine that's directed against them. So we have to always be on the alert, and we have to be willing to pivot or change depending on what variant does arrive. So I think the key, and unfortunately, this has been interpreted as, oh, you're changing your mind. No, we're adjusting to the change in the conditions.
Hey, Fred, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was I was about to lead into this question, because I'll give you something that's more contagious than omicron and stuff, which is disinformation. And so much of I spend a fair amount of time just trying to go through social media and go to various websites to understand what people are thinking. And obviously, the protests up in Canada have dominated headlines. There are other issues here in the United States. But so much of this, I think, is critical about our institutions and our science, as though, these are static conclusions. And the point you're making about the need to pivot with changed conditions, and the need to pivot with the data that reflects those changed conditions, that part of what hopefully we'll draw some lessons out of this pandemic, so we don't have to repeat the mistakes next time. But part of this, I think, is there was never really an explanation to the American people that science is not, all-knowing and all-perfect. The benefits of science and the benefit of data is that it provides an opportunity to rethink and to pivot and to shift and to respond to what we are learning, and the fact that what we know about something is never static. And I think that is one of the overarching lessons that, unfortunately is not appreciated. People ascribe all sorts of either ego or political, we'll call it, objectives to the scientific community. And many of these are men and women who are working, not only extraordinarily hard, but under extraordinary circumstances where decisions have to be made. They have to be made quickly. They have to be made balancing competing interests and always in the public interest. And so I'd actually like to, maybe I can get a little more, I'll call it, commentary out of you and Bill on this point, because this to me is, has been so fundamental in trying to manage the pandemic, is an understanding of science and how it works and why it is not static, and why, part, if it's done correctly, is you're learning and you're basically adjusting in response to changed circumstances and data that comes out of those changed circumstances. So let me just sort of sit back. I really would love to have your and Bill's thoughts around this.
Thank you, David. I'll get on my soapbox here. This has been, I tell you, a lot of experts in infectious disease who have been trying to share their knowledge and what their analysis have been criticized and denigrated. And I ran across an explanation that I think really fits with what has been going on. And it's by some psychologists, Dunning-Kruger effect. It's actually been described many years ago, and in psychology, and it's cognitive bias, whereby people with limited knowledge or competence in a given intellectual or social domain greatly overestimate their own knowledge and competence in the domain relative to the objective criteria or to performance of their peers and people in general. So they feel that they have the same expertise as those who've trained for years and years and really learned the craft, in this case, infectious diseases. And this problem, this Dunning-Kruger effect, is probably present in about a third of the U.S. population right now. And it has led to a high number of deaths. And I just saw yesterday that the death rate among the counties with the highest, who supported the strongest support for Trump, the death rate is very, very significantly higher than those counties that had a low support for Trump, because the Dunning-Kruger effect seemed to take hold predominantly in the Republicans and the politicians, the Republican politicians, who have really guided their supporters off a cliff, and also really encouraged this denigration of expertise. And it's called visceral bias. And the number of politicians have criticized Fauci and criticized really all the experts who are out there in the public trying to clarify the facts as they are. So I'll get off my soapbox, and Bill, maybe you can correct me.
No, I think you're right. But at the same time, there have been, with something so new, I think that even the experts are learning as they go. Everybody is. If you take Dr. Fauci, he's clearly made statements that have turned out to be incorrect. And if you take the expert coming from the other side of it, as Dr. Macquarie from Johns Hopkins, he's been incorrect on a few occasions too. But so it really does, when you've got a novel event, as this has been, everybody, from the experts to the lay, need to take everything you're seeing with a grain of salt. But the one other thing that, as we look at this, and maybe not, I don't want to say look back on it yet, but looking back at what we've done through all this, we've got to remember that this is not the last event that we're going to see. That through history, through most of recorded modern history even, we get significant epidemics, if not pandemics, every 4 to 7 years. You can count right back and you'll see them. They don't all have as much commercial impact as this has had, but it does mean that people, organizations, and governments need to take stock again of what we have done. One of the things that people don't appreciate is that when we had the pandemic flu fear, which never turned into happening in the 2009-2010 era, there was the U.S. government developed the National Response Plan, which then was modified when they realized that plans don't really work. It was modified into the National Response Framework, which was just a series of, here are the things you should think about, here are potential ways that you could go. But that, importantly, one of the major aspects of the NRF was a plea to various infrastructure segments within society to do the same thing. And while the NRF may not have been the huge help, going to the various infrastructure segments within the United States, they did develop their own response frameworks in many cases. A lot of them had to dust them off the shelves to come out, but there were a lot of large organizations we worked with that when I said, didn't you do this back in 2009, 2010? They said, oh yeah, and they went and pulled their plan off the shelf. So this does something that people and organizations do need to do is get your lessons learned, update your plan if you had one from 2010, and if you don't have one, then have one and put it on the shelf because you're going to need it again, almost guaranteed.
So, Bill and Fred, let me sort of add to your comments a little bit. because as a former prosecutor, I still remember that one of the most effective techniques in cross-examination is to find prior inconsistent statements of a witness. And credibility gets quickly destroyed when you point out that isn't a fact that you said X on a prior occasion, and on another occasion when you were, in front of X, Y, and Z, you said this. And what I find here, and as you said, Bill, and Fred, you've said this before, this is not going to be the last one. And, among the lessons here, I really think that there is a broad educational process that needs to take place about the benefits and the limits of science. There's a lot of great good that came out of this in terms of when you see how quickly an effective vaccine was created, see how it was done, how it was rolled out. Yes, mistakes were made along the way, but almost, I would say, unprecedented in the history of medicine in terms of what has happened here. There are also, lessons we learned about masks, wearing, and what we're shutting down, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of lessons afterwards. But there's a fundamental lesson that I don't think we can ignore, which is that there are men and women and institutions whose opinions we want, who will give the opinions based on certain data and what they know at the time. But they must be allowed to adjust and correct, as Fred said, pivot, and they may come up with a different conclusion later on, but that is not the basis for discrediting the institution or the people. And indeed, the risk I think we run, particularly in an environment where so many people have a voice and social media is loud, and it's relatively easy to organize sort of tribal warfare, is that we may very well lose. One of the casualties of this pandemic, as I talk to people, may be that some of our best people and our smartest people and our most caring people may no longer want to come out of the woodwork and share what they know and share their opinion at the risk of, exposing themselves and their family to, the mob. And I don't mean, capital M at their doorstep, but there is a mob out there that is, very quickly wants to seize upon experts who are doing their best with what they know on a particular time, look for the opportunity to point out the changed conclusions, ascribe all sorts of personal and political agendas to what they were doing, turn this into a tribal warfare. And one of the casualties may very well be that I don't need this in my life, and, I'm not going to do this again. And I know there have been, I'm not, please don't try to ascribe my political views here, but, the fact that Fauci has faced so many death threats as others have, that to me is a important casualty to put up there around the pandemic. And it is something we have to do a better job. We have to educate people about what it means to be a scientist, to be in the practice of medicine, and giving the best advice at a particular given time while reserving the right to pivot.
David, very well said. And I come back to thinking about the polio vaccine. And I was a very young child when that came out. And Salk was a hero. Salk could walk on water. Everyone listened to what he had to say. No one would dare criticize him. And there was a respect for expertise at that time that is slowly been eroded to the detriment of our society and the detriment really of the world. So I don't think people understand how damaging this has really been. And I think history will show that somewhere around a third of the deaths in the United States could have been prevented if the information, everybody had believed the experts. And think about this vaccine, which was developed in really record time and is equally efficacious as the polio vaccine. and actually far less side effects than the polio vaccine. And yet people denigrated the companies that say, they were just trying to make a profit, denigrated the infectious disease and infection control people who recommended it, and really twisted and turned the facts around in an extremely negative and destructive fashion. And we really have to look back, and we have to figure out how we can stop this from ever happening again.
I'd say amen to that, and I would say that there's plenty of responsibility on all sides of the political spectrum, and I still remember when the vaccines were coming out, there were certain people, prominent political figures who went on to take a different position, who would not take the vaccine and claim that it was not safe. And apropos, one of the benefits of having both of you, I think the messenger matters so much. Okay, and it cannot be one source of information. That as we think about, either the need to prepare for future pandemics, but I would say other forms of emergencies, et cetera, that we have to do a better job in identifying, the messengers in respective communities, in respective, we'll call it political circles, social circles, financial circles, et cetera, to, carry the message, to ask the questions that need to be asked, and then to carry the message. And, Bill, this is really, I think the point you were making, it's not just about a plan on the shelf. It's about how that plan gets implemented and acquiring the lessons from every crisis about what we can do better.
The old saying in the military is plans are everything before battle begins, and plans are worthless after the battle starts. The one other point that I think is real important as we look back is to remember that science is not monolithic. In some senses, in some cases it can be. You get data that's it's very clear, black and white, that's the way it is. But at other times, there are competing views, and the true scientist will take the competing views and weigh them and provide be a balanced, scored, so to speak, opinions on these differing views. I think sometimes what we ran into here was that people took a view and they dug in, and they were sticking with that view no matter what, and that was a problem. And then also, since the audience here is oftentimes organizational people, we've got to recognize that what is the pure public health guidance may have to be modified in an organizational setting. In some cases, more stringent than the general public health guidance is. In some cases, just different. So it is important for organizations to have help navigating a domain that is not their own knowledge domain, such as medicine or infection control, all of those things.
So I want to thank you both, because one of the purposes of this podcast was to find two intellectually honest brokers who could pivot, who were willing to rethink their assumptions, who were looking outside their immediate silos of information, and who would be willing to share their time and their expertise. So again, I'm going to reiterate the gratitude that you got to you guys for spending the time that you have. We're going to stay on a 2-week schedule unless something comes up that's particularly important. But in any event, thank you guys very, very much. Very much look forward to speaking to you in 2 weeks, and before then, if there's something material to share with the audience.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Dr. Bill Lang is an expert in public health responses to biological incidents, including pandemics. Dr. Fred Southwick is an infectious disease specialist at the University of Florida College of Medicine. Both doctors are part of the RANE Expert Network. Individuals and organizations turn to RANE for risk intelligence that cuts through the hype to focus on what they need to know, what to expect, and what to do. Sign up for our coronavirus solution. Visit us at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.